The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
The fact that the physical objects exist and have been preserved and we can see them and is jaw-dropping and magical.
Thanks to a twist of fate, the archives of Ernest Hemingway have been mostly preserved here at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. This week, a new film on the author was released by directors Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. We'll hear from two of the filmmakers and our scholar in residence of how the JFK Library's archives played a key role in the new documentary. That's next on this episode of JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter.
And I'm Jamie Richardson. The JFK Library is home to collections that document President Kennedy's life and career, as well as the lives and work of many people who worked in or interacted with the administration. However, what you may not know is that the library is also home to most of the papers and thousands of photographs belonging to the legendary American author, Ernest Hemingway.
The story of how Hemingway's papers, photos, and other artifacts ended up at our library in Boston is an interesting one. It all started with two widows, Jacqueline Kennedy and Mary Hemingway, who were looking to preserve their husbands' legacies for future generations. Right now, we are joined by the JFK Library's Hemingway Scholar in Residence, Hillary Justice, who can tell us exactly how those two women came together to help make the Ernest Hemingway collection a reality. Hillary, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So, Hillary, the Hemingway collection is sort of seeing big spotlight the last couple of months as the lead up to the Ernest Hemingway film by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. We just want to begin by just telling us, how did the Hemingway collection come to the JFK Library?
That's a great question. There's really no obvious connection between Ernest Hemingway and Boston. He came through Boston on the train a couple of times when he was about 11 with his mother on the way to Nantucket. And there's not an obvious connection between President Kennedy and Ernest Hemingway either. They never met. They weren't, fishing buddies or anything. They corresponded a couple of times briefly. In the 1950s, when Kennedy was working on his book, Profiles in Courage, he was trying to track down whether or not Hemingway actually said something. The definition of courage is grace under pressure. And Hemingway's great for having unattributed quotations. It's really hard to know what he said, if he said things. So Kennedy wrote to Ernest Hemingway asking whether the quotation was actually his or if he had a source for it. And if it was his, could he use it in his book? And Ernest Hemingway said, yes, it's mine, and sure you can. So then in 1961, for the inauguration, President-elect Kennedy invited Hemingway to attend, but Hemingway couldn't. He was in the Mayo Clinic at that point, suffering from a variety of illnesses. But he did send the president a cable congratulating him on a wonderful inauguration, mentioning that everyone at the Mayo had been watching on television. So that's really it for the connection between Ernest Hemingway and John F. Kennedy. It gets a lot more interesting, though, after Hemingway passes away. Ernest and Mary Hemingway's primary home was in Cuba. And of course, with US-Cuba relationships deteriorating badly, the Hemingways basically got stranded in the United States. All their stuff was still in Cuba. And so Mary Hemingway worked with the Kennedy White House to get permission to go back to Cuba and bring some of their things home. So after Mary Hemingway returned from Cuba, she then got an invitation to attend a White House dinner for Nobel Prize winners, where she met, obviously, the president and Mrs. Kennedy. And she was in the guest of honor position. She sat right next to the president. And apparently she spent the whole dinner giving him just a piece of her mind about how he was handling Cuba. She was a woman of forceful opinions. The president had some forceful opinions too. Apparently he found her rather irritating. But nonetheless, there they were. And then fast forward again to after the president was assassinated, Mary Hemingway read that Mrs. Kennedy was putting together her late husband's presidential library. And at this point, Mary Hemingway was in possession of a lifetime's worth of Ernest Hemingway's papers and photographs and other things. And she was looking for somewhere that would steward it, very specially set aside as the Ernest Hemingway collection. She'd been talking to the New York Public Library, but they couldn't promise her that they would keep Hemingway's things in a special Hemingway section. So they were interested, but they couldn't really give her what she wanted. So she wrote a letter to Mrs. Kennedy offering the complete Hemingway collection, about 90% of his manuscripts, 11,000 photographs, to be included in the presidential library. And Mrs. Kennedy wrote back and said she was honored. So that's how that happened.
It's pretty amazing, these two widows coming together for this important purpose.
The two women, I think they shared a sense of responsibility to history. They were both responsible while grieving for organizing and setting up the long-term legacies of their husbands. I can't imagine how they found the strength to do it, either one of them. But perhaps there was a moment of kinship that helped them both.
And now that we have the collection, or the collections at the Kennedy Library, what is exactly in it? What comprises the collection?
The collection, it's divided into sort of three categories. There's the textual collection, which is anything on a piece of paper. So that would be everything from the first draft of The Sun Also Rises to random notes that Hemingway would work on trying to get his French right when he's writing a letter. There was a problem with a key to the apartment in Paris, and he was trying to write a note to the French landlord, but his French was terrible. So he had to take 3 or 4 tries at that. We've got that. Bullfight tickets, maps, the over 45 endings to A Farewell to Arms. In addition, we've got Hemingway's correspondence, both incoming and outgoing. He would often do carbon copies of things while he was at the typewriter. So he'd keep a copy of a letter and mail the original off, sometimes writing notes on things, sometimes drawing pictures on them. So we've got all of that. Additionally, we have the photographs collection, which is over 11,000 photographs just in Ernest and Mary's personal collection alone. And then there are several supporting collections. Some of the photographers who followed Hemingway around when he was a little bit more famous, they've donated, or their estates have donated their photographs to sort of support the main Hemingway collection as well. And then we have a selection of very small mementos, Hemingway's good luck charms, his wallet, eyeglasses, a briefcase, and some small bits of folk art that he and Mary collected during their travels. We have a few statuettes from Africa. We also have photographs of those same statuettes in his study in Cuba with the famous Hemingway cats sort of playing around them as kittens. So we can triangulate amongst what Hemingway was writing at a certain time. He had this object in his home, and here's some photographs of it. Mary Hemingway was a pretty good amateur photographer, so she documented their life pretty extensively.
Why do you think it's so special to have the Kennedy Library share this collection? What are the benefits of the collection being housed here at the library?
Well, first and foremost, it's the expertise of the archivists and the access that we have to absolutely world-class preservation and also organization. A collection like this could easily be overwhelming. Hemingway's papers came from various places. There were steamer trunks he left in storage in Paris. There were papers stuffed into drawers in Cuba. So simply getting a list and getting that list organized, or a catalog, an item by item catalog of what is in the collection, is what renders it usable. And people often don't appreciate the expertise it takes on behalf of the archivists just to make sure they know what things are, where they are, that they're safe to use, that if any of them need preservation, they get it. So being part of the National Archives and Records Administration, Hemingway's papers have access to absolutely the best that is available in behind the scenes archives work. From a scholar's perspective or a researcher's perspective, I don't know how to explain even the scope of it. You basically get to come to one place and do 90% of your research. You might need to make another trip to, that copy of the letter only exists in Texas, or, to see this piece by Hemingway's wife, I have to go up to her alma mater at Bates. But it's incredibly rare to have 90% of an author's papers in the same library. Authors' estates often get, if they don't get donated, in total somewhere like Hemingway's did or Fitzgerald's did to Princeton, they get sold off. They get inherited through, multiple members of a next generation. Someone hits hard economic times, they have to sell things to earn some money. That happens. There's an economic reality to everyone's lives. So it's almost unheard of that having an author's papers and photographs and mementos in the same place that's not actually a museum, a house museum. It's really a treasure. It's almost unique, I think, in the world. There's one other author whose papers are held by the Presidential Library System. That's Laura Ingalls Wilder. So Laura Ingalls Wilder scholars have the same sort of advantage as Hemingway scholars. I know, they're strange bedfellows. You almost never think of these two authors in the same thought. But they do have one thing in common, and it's that neither one of them went to college. And so unlike Fitzgerald, whose papers obviously went to Princeton, he had fond feelings about Princeton. Hemingway's and Wilder's, they didn't really have a place to go.
And now your title is Hemingway Scholar in Residence, which is a little bit unusual for the JFK Library, I think. So what does that entail? What do you do? How do you help folks at the library?
Working at the JFK Library, it's just the opportunity of a lifetime. In my position, I'm responsible for outreach for the local, national, and international audiences. So I raise awareness of the Ernest Hemingway collection and everything we hold in it for all these various audiences. I do everything from hosting in-person visiting classes and book clubs to preparing and delivering research presentations at scholarly conferences, some of which are international. In 2018, I curated our permanent Hemingway exhibit, A Life Inspired. I'm also responsible for developing Hemingway's digital presence through newsletters and expanding our website offerings. And I develop and steward institutional relationships as well with other Hemingway Museum Consortium members and with the International Hemingway Society. One of the parts of my role that I most enjoy is advising on special projects with external stakeholders. Most recently, of course, for the Hemingway documentary. And right now I'm working on one with the Hemingway family.
And in your role, how did you help the filmmakers, Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and the others working on that documentary?
Well, initially, I got a phone call from one of their production staff who was looking for information on Hemingway's typewriters. One of the things that features in the documentary, there are scenes of old typewriters and someone typing on them, and they wanted to make sure that they had the correct model, the correct make of all the typewriters. So we bonded by geeking out over typewriters. I think that was my first phone call from the filmmakers. Later on, I worked more closely with them as they were looking toward their soundtrack. One of my areas of scholarly expertise is Hemingway and music, and it's both music that was popular at various points and places in Hemingway's lifetime, and also Hemingway's own personal record collection. I had the opportunity to catalog that while I was in Cuba. So what was Hemingway listening to while he was writing? And it's a fascinating area of study, but it's one that you don't really think of as a reader or even a researcher. But when you're a filmmaker, you need a soundtrack. And so they were looking for both original pieces that Hemingway would have listened to, and then ideas for the composer that they worked with, who did some brilliant work. A popular song from the era might be in the wrong mood for whatever they'd need in a particular passage in their script with particular images. And so the composer would pick up, motifs that are sort of reminiscent, say, of Erik Satie, who is very evocative of Paris in the 1920s, but he'd change the key and make it perhaps a little bit calmer so it wouldn't detract from focus. Soundtrack work is incredibly detailed. I learned a lot about it during the production of the documentary. And then finally, I was able to attend a screening. They had a full rough cut of the entire documentary, and they brought in some people to attend a screening and take notes and give them feedback. And so my job for that was to listen to every single music cue, decide whether it worked for that part. It's like, why is the Spain motif showing up in Paris? You might want to switch those, that kind of thing. That was the thrill of a lifetime. That was definitely a career high point.
And when this episode goes out, the documentary will already have been aired on PBS, so hopefully folks have seen it or will watch it after this. But what do you hope people take away from this documentary and this new look at his life and work?
I think it's everyone's central hope that people take away a little bit more nuance than they might have had going in, whether they're Hemingway fans or, Hemingway haters. The documentary, it doesn't flinch, and it offers something. It offered things I'd never seen before. I'm pretty objective and fairly rational, but by the end of episode 3, I needed the Kleenex. And I thought I was immune to the end of the story. I know how that story ends. I've known how that story ended, forever, feels like. But the takeaway that I hope people get is that he wasn't always an old man with glasses and a fairly hostile attitude toward the world. I think it does a great job of showing him young and ambitious and hopeful, and then telling his story from there. The other thing I hope people take away, and this is speaking a little bit as a scholar, but more generally just as a lover of literature, is the attention that he paid to detail when he was writing. He really took his craft incredibly seriously. And one of those quotes that everyone wants to attribute to Ernest Hemingway is write drunk, edit sober. No, sorry. That man wrote sober for his entire life. He cared about every punctuation mark, every verb tense, every word choice. And I think the documentary makers did a brilliant job showing that. They used animation to recreate the motion of his pencil on the pages. Hemingway was a fine craftsman. His reputation, just as a writer, is completely deserved. His reputation as a human being, that's more troubling and more problematic, but I hope people get some nuance there too.
Hemingway, you said some people love him, some people hate him. There are all sorts of feelings. Why do you think Hemingway will have a continued lasting presence in American literature? We know right now people read him at high school grade levels and on. Why do you think he continues to persevere?
I think one of the writers that they interviewed in the documentary probably says it best. He was an amazing observer of human beings. His characters are human beings. They fall in love. They love the taste of a good wine. The other reason, though, and this is probably a better answer, I don't mean for it to sound dismissive, he was just a hell of a good writer. And good writing is going to last. It's interesting. Hemingway's reputation globally is very different than it is in the United States. In our current problematic and difficult cultural moment. If you go to Cuba, Hemingway is considered a Cuban writer. They're not worried about the fact that he was male. They're not worried about the fact that he was a North American. They think he was a fantastic writer. And so Hemingway is taught as a Cuban writer in the Cuban school system. So, we in the United States, we occupy a certain position of privilege, but we need to check ourselves and think that perhaps the American view that we've inherited of Hemingway as part of American culture, it's not necessarily the one that's shared worldwide. And I think the documentary will reach a global audience. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. I wish I had a time turner like in Harry Potter, and I could, go, maybe what I need is a TARDIS. I'm not really sure, but I'd love to jump ahead about 100 years and just, see if people are still reading Hemingway. My bet is that they will be.
Well, thank you, Hillary. I would also love a TARDIS and go into the future and also jump back into the past. So thank you for joining us and continuing your work as the Hemingway Scholar in Residence.
Thank you for having me.
This week, a new 3-part documentary series premiered on PBS about Ernest Hemingway. The film, directed by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, takes a deeper look at both Hemingway the author and Hemingway the person. The film would not have been possible without the well-preserved Ernest Hemingway collection here at the JFK Library. To tell us more about the film and how the JFK Library's archives played a role, we're happy to be joined by director Lynn Novick and producer Sarah Botstein. Lynn, Sarah, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So here we have your documentary about Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway. What inspired you to make this film now? What was kind of the impetus to get the story out?
This project has been in the works for quite a long time. For me, it really began with a visit to Key West, where Hemingway lived for a number of years in the 1920s and 30s. I visited there about 25 years ago and went into his workroom and saw some of his artifacts and thought about the work that he created there and got very interested in who he was, and bought a biography on my way out at the door, read it, and sort of became fascinated with the ways that his personal life and his fiction overlap and blur together, and wanting to make a film that would sort of represent the life of this American icon and how it unfolded seemed really, really interesting to me. Meanwhile, Ken Burns and Jeff Ward had been thinking about writers and iconic American subjects, and Hemingway had been on some sort of list, but it wasn't really on the front burner at all. Sarah and Ken and Jeff and I finally decided to actually make the film while we were working on our Vietnam series.
And so I guess the question is, why is now a good time to make a biography on Hemingway?
To just piggyback on what Lynn was just saying, I've never made a film where we've said, this is a good time to make a film. It is kind of an organic process. We sit down every few years as a senior team and think about the films we all want to make, the films we're interested in making, the films as a group we feel, as Lynn was saying, Ken and Jeff and Lynn and me are really willing to dive in and spend 5-10 years of our life living with a person, a subject. And when we start a film and when the film comes out, the world is often extremely different. So for Hemingway, that is certainly the case. I remember in 1997, us having a discussion about whether one day we should all do Hemingway. And it wasn't until 2012 or 2013 or 2014 that we went, okay, we're really going to do Hemingway now. And from that point to now, our country's understanding of how to think about biography, how to think about race, how to think about writers, how to think about artists, how to think about our culture generally has changed. And that not only, I think, in the background influenced how we made a film about Hemingway, but obviously influences the conversation that we're having about him now.
I agree completely. I just sort of jump in to say that being said, this is a great time for a film about Hemingway to come out. And we never could have predicted exactly what this moment would be. Certainly our understanding of the canon, our understanding of who matters, our rethinking of whose voices should be heard, and also the representation of a certain kind of masculine identity that he so much embodies and yet is so very, very complicated. We're thinking about all of these things in, at least I'll say for myself, a much deeper way, and trying to get into, the underbelly of all of the reasons why he's famous and his work and what it says about us, and also what makes it so enduring.
And I think we went to a Hemingway conference in 2016 when we were really at the beginning stages of putting the film together and thinking about who to interview and what kind of a film to make. And I remember walking out of one of the events and Lynn and me looking at each other and saying, this is a great time to make Hemingway. Who would have thought? Because we've been talking about it for so long. So that's just a kind of how our process evolves.
And talking about Hemingway, what makes him stand out so much? What makes him such a compelling figure and author to have this really deep dive and nuanced look at him?
Hemingway holds our attention for two primary reasons. The first and foremost is his actual writing, his work, especially, I would say for me, his fiction, his greatest works of fiction. Some of his short stories and several of his novels are extraordinarily important literary works in the history of American writing and in history of the world literature. And his influence is, I would say, astonishingly enduring. And so regardless of anything else about him, we should be interested in him because of that. And then on top of that, because of the way he lived his life, the persona he constructed, how famous he was, his relationship to his own celebrity, his wrestling with mental illness and addiction, and sort of an unraveling at the end of his life, very much in the public eye. It's kind of a cautionary tale of what happens when you get so famous, and what is our relationship to a figure like that. So it's actually an outsized life and an extraordinary literary legacy. And those are the two things that we thought commended him to our attention.
You talk about Ernest Hemingway's struggles and who he was. I think part of your film is sort of the myth versus the reality of who he was. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, that gets to the heart of biography, right? If you're examining a well-known life, there's always the myth versus how you can try to get close to somebody that you've never met, that you won't meet, and that many, many, many people have been trying to understand for so long. I think different interpretations of biography are always fascinating to me as you yourself try to understand a person. And certainly to underscore what Lynn was just saying, I think Hemingway, his enduring influence around the world as a writer is a very exciting and interesting part of the film for me. We interviewed writers of different ages. The writers that we interviewed from around the world of different ages, different backgrounds, different genders, all have been deeply influenced by him in their writing, and his influence on them as artists and writers continues to this day. And he's this complicated, flawed, sometimes unlikable, sometimes mean, often unlikable, often mean, complicated guy who, had a very tragic life. And that makes for an interesting story. Compelling, I think. And his influence is we're still wrestling with him as an influential writer, whether we like him or not.
What about you, Lynn? What has it been like to sort of decompile the myth of Hemingway into this film?
I almost put the myth and the public persona into its own special kind of category of knowing him, which I am fascinated by, how someone constructs a myth about themselves, tells stories that aren't true, begins to believe them, reenacts or performs a kind of masculinity in the sense of modern, understanding of that term. That has a kind of weight of its own, and it becomes heavier and heavier as he gets older. And, being able to go back to the beginning of his life and see how that process began, probably right after he came back from the First World War as a young former ambulance driver who had been wounded and started embellishing his war stories to an extreme degree right away, but then also wrote in fiction about how he hated the fact that people lied about their war stories and that the public wanted to hear the lies. And so you sort of tell them, but you hate yourself for doing it. So what's so fascinating about Hemingway, among many things, is that on the one hand, there's sort of a, to me, very unappealing hyper-masculine persona that just, is concerning as a way of being in the world for us today. But on the other hand, it's his own awareness from the earliest stages of his writing of the problems with that. And the conversation he's always involved in his fiction and nonfiction and in his letters and different, ways we get to know him about why this is so fraught. So that's just so fascinating, because I think a lot of people we think of as celebrities, we don't realize what level of self-awareness they may or may not have. With Hemingway, we have access to all of that through his fiction and also through this unbelievable treasure trove of letters. The Letters Project, which is a multi-year undertaking, has been collecting, I think, more than 6,000 letters that he wrote in his lifetime and publishing them in a series of volumes that'll probably be something like 18 or 19 books when they're done. And, a lot of it is, what you had for breakfast and, who we talked to and this, it's a very mundane, a lot of it. But what happens is in the course of the letters, you begin to see him in conversation with people and sort of have a sense of how he really talked, what he really thought. And there's an intimacy to that, which is sort of the opposite of this public persona.
And an ego to that I find totally fascinating.
Oh, to save every letter and to make carbon copies.
Knowing, as one of our interviewees say, they probably will see the light of day some point. You're pretty famous. You're saving literally everything. Who wants to know that much about it? That's a very fascinating ego involved here too.
Indeed.
And so in addition to the Letters Project, the JFK Library has a really great resource of all things Hemingway. So were you surprised to find out that, at the JFK Library, John F. Kennedy, here we have Ernest Hemingway as well?
Definitely. When Lynn and I first started doing research, we're like, oh, the Hemingway collection is housed at the JFK Library? Okay. We now understand why that is. And we all, both Lynn and me and everyone on our team, spent an awful lot of time there over the course of making this film. And I think the most exciting and overwhelming treasure trove of Hemingway's materials are the fact that he wrote and rewrote his manuscripts and was such a craftsman and kept all of that. And looking at those manuscripts and then being able to film them was a total privilege and a real treat and a wonderful part of making this film.
I sort of wonder if Hemingway were working today on a computer You don't save every draft unless he printed out every draft and wrote on that and then made those corrections and saved a new draft in a very meticulous way of creating his own archive. We wouldn't ever know what he did. So the fact that the physical objects exist and have been preserved and we can see them and is jaw-dropping and magical.
What was it like, or how helpful was it to have so much of the material there, like in front of you to, page through and see the notations and all the shopping lists and receipts and logs and all of that? How was that helpful for the documentary? And just kind of personally, I imagine that would be an incredible moment.
It's crazy helpful, just very practically. We don't, usually we're piecing together from 15 or 20 different archives that have different parts of a person's life or different aspects of history. And obviously we did research at a lot of other places besides the JFK Library, things that weren't totally specific to Hemingway or complementary. And we do, our archival source material comes from around the world and from hundreds of sources. But it was the place we spent the most time, had the most material, and the people who work there are extremely knowledgeable and became very, very helpful and really good friends, both to all of us on the team and to the project. So it's a lucky and exciting and fun, and we love that stuff.
I mean, I've been reading Hemingway since I was in high school. So The Sun Also Rises was my sort of first experience of Hemingway. And then I read a number of short stories, and then I read The Farewell to Arms. And to be able to come, and some of the incredible short stories, many of them are incredible, but to be able to, even in photocopy, to request the folder and open it up and see, here are the 8 drafts of Indian Camp. I don't know the exact number, but, in his handwriting with the alternate beginning and subtle changes in language, or to see the different titles for The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber, The End of a Marriage. I mean, there's all these different, just his doodles are fascinating. And, when you just open up a book and read it, you don't really understand everything that went into the creation of that text. And to be able to sort of get inside his head and see his handwriting on, a scrap of paper, it's like opening a portal into him as an artist, that you just so rarely have. There really are no words for describing what this was like for us.
You mentioned that you read Hemingway in high school, and I also read Ernest Hemingway in high school, and I think many people can relate to that. Why do you think Hemingway's writing continues to endure more than a half a century after his death? And do you think people will continue reading him far into the future?
I do think his influence has withstood the test of, many decades and seems to still be relevant and important when studying American literature. But he does go in and out of being taught and at what age he's taught. I think a lot of people read Hemingway at a young age, and actually they should read Hemingway when they're a bit older. We have had a lot of discussion about that, particularly Old Man and the Sea, which is often taught in junior high, right? And high school, when I think you should read that book when you're over 40.
I think your question, sorry, I was so fascinated, lost track, but about whether Hemingway still is relevant.
Endures.
So why
does he continue to endure?
Right.
Yes.
I think it's his enduring legacy is probably a combination of several things. And lots of scholars have commented on this and know much more than I do, but partly it's the way he communicates, and that his work is accessible. He said he wanted to be read by highbrows and lowbrows, and that you didn't have to have a college education to appreciate his work. And as Sarah was just saying, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it, but it can be read on many levels. So I suspect that it is accessible, and but that doesn't mean it's simple. There's enormous depth beneath that simplicity. One of our academic advisor scholars says in the film, Hemingway dares to impersonate simplicity, which is a really interesting point, that there's so much there. And that's where the manuscripts and us having gained an understanding of what he did to create these works, how much he put down and then took away, so he could sort of strip down to the essence of what he was trying to get across and leave a lot to the reader to think about and figure out and to sort of relate to and be in dialogue with. So there's a lot of ambiguity in the work, which I think also lends to its enduring value because you can argue and discuss what actually happened. What did that person mean? Hills Like White Elephants, let's just say, for example. We talked to multiple people about it and they had different opinions about whether she did or did not get the abortion at the end. Who knows? He doesn't tell you. And that sort of the confidence to let the audience or the reader come to their own conclusion. I think that means that any generation can read this and bring to it who they are and what they believe and how they think. I think that has something to do with it. And it's probably also the subject matter.
I was just going to say what Lynn is saying is making me think of what I should have said earlier, which is he often writes about very universal, not mundane, but normal human experiences or experiences that lots of us will go through: relationships, marriages, war, loss. So if you're reading, he's very interested in dropping you in a moment and in detail. How does something smell? How does something taste? What does something feel like? But you don't have, as Lynn was saying, a lot of context around it. And that's an interesting way to approach a subject and approach your reader, and I think is enduring.
It's also, we could go on about this is sort of the central question in a way of the film is, what is there here for us today? And why do we still care about this man and his work? And I was reading a section of Farewell to Arms last night. I've kind of been rereading a little bit and just as the film is coming out. And there's a scene, where Frederick Henry goes back to the front and he's back in his old room with his old friend, the Italian surgeon Rinaldi, and they're, happy to see each other. And they have this kind of conversation where Rinaldi's calling Frederick Henry baby, and he's saying, give me a kiss. And, there's a very interesting depiction of what we might say is a bromance, or maybe we might say that, and there's some allusions to things that they're not going to talk about, that there's something complicated going on there possibly, and maybe 2 generations ago would have read that one way and we would read it another way today, and another generation in the future will read it another way. And I think that's what makes it timeless in a way. That's just one example, but it stands up to that. And some other works just feel dated, like don't relate to us somehow. It's also true. I think we have to really acknowledge and talk about the fact that our sense of what is the canon, who should be read, whose voices deserve to be heard, who gets to speak, who's writing the reviews, who's doing the publishing, all of that in our country right now is a very important and long overdue conversation about voices that have been marginalized, voices that haven't been heard, and who gets represented and how. And so, Hemingway has to earn his place in that pantheon for every generation, and rightfully so.
That's great. And thinking about voices that are heard and who gets to participate in the conversation, I believe you mentioned earlier you had kind of a range of people you talked to for the documentary. So who did you talk to? Who did you go to for either interpretation or thoughts on Hemingway?
We spoke on and off camera to a wide range of writers from around the world, but I think a few of the stars of the film who are in and really have a lot to say and are very influential, at least for me and my understanding of Hemingway, are Edna O'Brien, Abraham Verghese, Mary Karr, Tobias Wolff, Mario Vargas Llosa. Those are Tim O'Brien. I think he's the one who's the most interesting to talk to about your own life, fact, fiction, embellishment, who is who. Think about the things they carried, his own relationship to the Vietnam War, that he's written about this 1 year of his life, his entire life, and who Tim O'Brien is, and all of that is, we could have endless dinner conversations about that. So those are just a few of them.
And, we can't finish this interview without coming back to the 2 men who are in our collection, President Kennedy and Ernest Hemingway. Both were larger-than-life figures in their times. Both actually did a little bit of talking to each other. President Kennedy cited Ernest Hemingway in Profiles in Courage. There was some telegraph communication. But the question I have for you is, do you draw any similarities between these 2 men, these 2 Americans, particularly in how they captured the imagination and attention of their audiences?
Well, as you were asking the question, I was, I haven't thought about Kennedy in the same way that we've been thinking about Hemingway for the last 5 years. So trying to run through my brain of what do I know about John F. Kennedy. Obviously, I know a fair amount as a student of American history, but I do think he's an interesting counterpoint to Hemingway, and that he clearly is influenced by Hemingway and by the persona that Hemingway created, and by the idea of courage and, grace under pressure, and the sense of kind of living your one and only life, and, the kind of very strong masculine values that Hemingway seemed to embody in his life and even in his military experience, especially in the Spanish Civil War and Second World War. And Kennedy, as a consummate politician, had to construct his own myth and his own persona with a different kind of goal, not to become an immortal literary figure, but to become a very powerful American politician and political leader. And he seemed to understand, just maybe more so even than Hemingway, or certainly in a similar way, how to do that. And I wonder what kind of conversation, not actual conversation, but how much he was thinking about Hemingway and what he represented when John F. Kennedy was constructing his own persona. Hemingway wasn't really overtly involved in politics that much in his life. He got politically engaged in the 30s during the Depression and the Spanish Civil War, and kind of, developed a kind of a political consciousness, a progressive political consciousness to a degree. And he lived in Cuba, which was not a progressive country when he lived there. And what we know that I find truly devastating is that he, at the end of his life, he was very unwell with a lifelong problem with alcoholism, with many concussions and brain disease, probably as a result of that, a mood disorder and suicidal, psychotic depression. And he was really not able to function. And after JFK was elected, he was asked to write something for the inauguration. He wasn't going to be able to attend because he wasn't well enough. And from what we understand, he was in such bad shape, he was not able to write even a paragraph in honor of President Kennedy's inauguration. And that was one of the sort of contributing factors to his, really feeling that he couldn't continue to live the way that he was living. So it's a really devastating thought that he really wanted to celebrate President Kennedy's election and inauguration, and he actually was not physically and mentally able to do so. And it kind of comes full circle that the papers are at the Kennedy Library is such a beautiful thing, how that ended up happening as a result of this sort of connection between the two men is not well known and really beautiful.
All right, well, Lynn and Sarah, I want to thank you both so much for taking time to speak with us. We are so excited to see Hemingway on PBS starting on April 5th. Best of luck. It'll be wonderful, we know. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great to talk with you.
And with that, we wrap up this episode of JFK 35. Be sure to check out our podcast page, where we'll have links to blog posts and media galleries featuring Ernest Hemingway, as well as a discussion with the directors about the new film. If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org, or tweet at us at JFK Library using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.